So it's a warm welcome from Catalyst Wonfor. I'm Damion Wonfor, and I'm the founder of Catalyst, and it's really great to welcome some familiar names and also some new people to the webinar today on inclusive leadership. So I'll talk about the session in a short while, and also the guest panelist today that I'm going to be speaking to, Tracy May. But just to start this session, I always find it useful just to talk a little bit about some housekeeping. So the first of this is we are recording the session today, so everybody is on mute. You can interact with us via the chat panel, so please feel free to pose any questions or comments on there as we're working through this topic today. The session's going to be around about 30 minutes, perhaps to a little bit longer, depending on the questions that we have from the group. I would encourage you to have a pen and paper handy, just in case there's some real insights for you to take away in terms of your own thinking about this topic, but also as your work as coaches, just in terms of anything that you want to take away further to reflect on. And I will ask Tracy for some thoughts about resources as we're working through the topic today as well. So I always encourage people to close down any applications, so email, etc. I always find this helps with presence, but also it just limits any interferences with the transmission speed of today's session. So let me just start by welcoming a close colleague of mine, Tracy May, to the call. So Tracy is an executive coach. She's the founder of the Diversitas Group based out in Dubai. Some of you may have listened to the webinar that we ran last year on cultural intelligence. And it's great really to have Tracy on the call with her expertise around inclusion, diversity. So yes, welcome Tracy.
Great to be here. Thanks, Damion.
And perhaps just to start, before we ask the group to reflect on any questions they have, maybe just perhaps a bit of background in terms of how you've connected with this topic in your own work.
Yeah, so working in the diversity space obviously gets your thinking going in terms of, what is diversity, what is the impact of diversity on organizational life, and what is the response that we need to make to the level of diversity that we're encountering in the workplace today. And what might good leadership look like when you examine it through the lens of diversity and inclusion. And I guess that's what really got my interest going to inclusive leadership, and what is the leadership that we require in the diverse world of work today. And of course, that's a very interesting topic to explore. It's very timeless, it's very relevant. It's not an academic subject, it's a subject that is really relevant to everybody's experience in the workplace today. So I guess that's really what caused me to begin to explore this topic for the first time, probably a few years ago in real earnest.
Thank you, Tracy. So before we move into our conversation, and I have got some questions that I've prepared that I'd like to work through with Tracy, and Tracy's going to share a couple of models for us to think about as well. But as always, we'd like to make sure that we're delivering the conversation in the areas you would like us to discuss and touch on. So at this point, we are going to just pause for a moment and just see what questions you're holding in terms of the topic today. So on the chat panel, it'd be wonderful if you could just type some questions for Tracy and I to talk about in relationship to inclusive leadership. So what questions are you holding? So please feel free to add those to the chat panel just so we can see where the interest is. Okay, so thanks, Martin. I can see a question coming through about what we might be experiencing in terms of the coachee. Just any other questions that people are holding around this topic? Yeah, thanks, Julie. Again, a question around how we can support coaches who may be experiencing more of a non-inclusive leadership. We'll just see if there's any other questions coming through. So we'll leave this, the chat panel is going to be running. So if you've got other questions coming through, please feel free to add those. Yeah, thanks, Damion. And Debbie, I can see the question, and Sophie. Yeah, great. So I'm sure these are the topics are very dear to Tracy's heart, just knowing Tracy and the work that she does. So again, we will pause a bit later, but let's just start with the first question, which is, in terms of this as a topic, why is it important?
So for me, one of the reasons why inclusive leadership is important is because it draws our attention in the leadership debate from leadership intention to leadership impact. And the experience of inclusion or exclusion is very much a relational one. And it is very unique to each individual. It is very subjective. It is very much a felt experience. And I think for that reason, when we start to talk about inclusion, we need to focus on leadership impact. Most leaders have positive intention. Most leaders want to be good leaders. Most people wake up in the morning going, I'm going to be as positive, inclusive, engaging as I can today. And a lot of what we're seeing in the workplace is those efforts are not really landing. And so I think why inclusive leadership is important is because it draws our focus and our debate to how do we create that positive impact in our leadership? How do we create that positive felt experience of inclusion? And how do we do it in such a way that people's subjective experience is positive? Knowing that we're dealing with diversity, knowing that we're dealing with people who have different needs, different values, different sensitivities, different triggers. This is the kind of, landscape, if you like, of inclusive leadership. And it's important that we start to explore this because from my perspective, working in organizations in the last 20 years, our leadership models are not working, our current leadership models. So perhaps it's useful for me to talk to how I see the current leadership model, regardless of sort of what leadership theory informs your model. I think there is something about current leadership models that limit their impact. So if you'll forgive the formatting, the interesting formatting here, but when I look at traditional leadership, it looks to me very much like an IU kind of deal. It's about an agreement between two people where we're going to try and create some sort of alliance together, and we're going to find a common cause, if you like, and a common focus, and then we're going to give ourselves to it. But if you look at the Venn diagram in front of you, you can see that it's a very limited relational space. And if I ask you to come over to my side and do more for me, the corollary, the inverse effect on you is that you lose some of your space. So it's very much a scarcity model. Leaders pushing their followers harder. I need more from you. I need you to do longer hours. I need you to give more to this project, to this vision, to this organizational dream. And the impact on followers is that they have to give up some of themselves. And so it feels like a very tension-filled kind of alliance. And I think it exacerbates the difference between people and the distance between people. There's this idea of I need to give something away in order to receive something. And the focus is very much on trying to keep this tenuous balance of a fair deal. And what I notice when I work with people in organizations, that the psychological contract that sits here is very easily upset. So somebody can feel quite valued and included, and then something arbitrary happens to them, like their parking bay gets taken away. Suddenly this no longer feels like a fair deal, and they now want to take some of their personal ground back. And so you have this constant negotiated tension between people. And the focus is really not on growing and generating. The focus is really on not being exploited or not being manipulated. And somehow, in the midst of all this tension, preserving personal space. I don't think that's working. So inclusive leadership invites a completely different way to think about the alliance between two people. And it's really based on an abundance mindset. It's not so much around living in that narrow space of the overlap between you and me, but it's about looking for a we space. So it's moving from I, you to we. And it's about exploring what becomes possible when two people are allowed to retain their own space, but together create a third space to work together. It's that third space alliance that inclusive leadership invites us into. And it's a one-size-fits-one kind of space. The space that's created between two people is unique to those two people. That's why inclusive leadership is a relational space. And a lot of leaders are nervous about that. They want a leadership formula, they want a leadership process, but they don't necessarily want to explore the possibilities that lie within the relational space for all sorts of reasons. But I think this is what inclusive leadership is. So moving from me versus you to me and you, discovering new ways of working together. How do we add value together? How do we achieve this project? How do we transform the culture? How do we discover new ways of being effective together? And how do we enter into that sort of synergistic place where the whole is more than the sum of the parts? This is the space of inclusive leadership, and this is why it matters.
Thank you, Tracy. And I suppose just a couple of reflections. For me, I suppose at some level I was always assuming this was more of an attitude rather than I'm really hearing about the impact and the way that the leader is actually in relationship with the team or teams. And I suppose the other thing I'm just reflecting on is the work that we've done recently together with a group in a professional services firm, a group of partners, really helping them think about how consciously they discuss the psychological contracts with their teams. So there's something here around me, the leader needing to have courage to do this, actually.
Absolutely. And I think, it is about attitude and it is about skills, but that's not the starting point. I think the starting point is the leader's relationship to their own leadership. What am I here to do? And when they start looking at that from an impact perspective, they can start asking themselves questions like, what does good look like in terms of my leadership? What is the impact I'm trying to create? And starting to think about this generative space. And from that space, thinking about what's the attitude I need to have and what are the skills I need to develop in order to explore the space and sustain the relationship in this third space. So it's a philosophical shift in leadership. And of course, that goes with an opportunity to build new skills and an opportunity to shift thinking and attitude as well.
I don't know, we've had conversations around conscious leadership, but there's something in here about being very aware of my intention and the impact that I'm potentially having. So again, feel free to add any reflections as you're listening, that this might stimulate other questions, and feel free to add those to the chat panel. But I think it just takes us to this next piece then, thinking about organizations, because a lot of organizations are running diversity and inclusion programs, but I suppose at some level, are they really challenging their philosophy of the way that they're leading the organization if it is about this third space? So what are some of the challenges that you experience, Tracy, in terms of organizations shifting to a more inclusive leadership style?
Yeah, and I think organizations globally, I mean, certainly in the markets that I work in, are somewhat in crisis around their whole reason for being. So, the traditional mantra has been we're here to create profit for the shareholders, we're here to grow, we're here to increase our market share. But of course, in the current economic climate, that's becoming more and more difficult, and playing that reactive short game of, how do we increase our billable hours, how do we increase our profit margins, how do we put more pressure on our people, that is creating a kind of a crisis situation in organizations where capable people are being put under pressure to do more and more, headcount is very lean, and of course the end game of that is burnout. So that's the sort of landscape. And in that kind of climate, it's very difficult for leaders to begin to think about the long game and perhaps some other goals around organizational purpose, such as sustainability, such as attracting the best talents and developing their people, and taking on that mandate to say that, when our people come to us, they're at a certain level, but by being with us, we take them to the next level. And as we take them to the next level, so the organization moves to the next level. So the crisis is quite deep. And the biggest sort of challenge to moving into this new way of thinking is the current pressures that exist. But ultimately, leaders and organizations are coming to the place of realizing that trying harder in the old model is not necessarily going to work. And we have to change our philosophy. And I think, going back to the client work that we do, we're starting to see that. We're starting to see people open up to think, okay, what am I really here to do as a leader? And what does good look like for this organization? Is it more billable hours, or is it really creating a sustainable ecosystem where people can, thrive and produce their best and really enable the organizational vision? So we're in that pinch point at the moment, but what's emerging out of that, of course, is those deeper questions about what's our organizational purpose and how do we lead people and how do we create an inclusive ecosystem that is going to, produce this sustainable outcome that we're looking for. I recently created a terrarium, which was a lot of fun, but it's basically a self-sustainable ecosystem in a bottle. And it was a real metaphor for me of, when you create the right environment, the ecosystem sustains itself. We're doing a lot of remedial stuff in organizations at the moment. And if we take a remedial lens onto inclusive leadership, well, it's limiting in the sense that, if a leader's not being inclusive, well, you need to be more inclusive, so you need to be less biased around sexual orientation, and we've had some of those questions come up around how do you deal with that. But if you're taking that sort of remedial approach, you really are working in the old paradigm. But if you're thinking about, well, how do you support this leader to create this self-sustaining ecosystem, inclusive ecosystem, so that it really supports its own life and growth, I think that's a more useful conversation.
And picking up one of the phrases on one of your slides, the sum's greater than the parts.
Exactly.
So there's a reflection from Kimberly there about how does this model require a shift in style away from the command and control hierarchy, the traditional, to a more fluid, networked way of working.
Yeah, and it absolutely does, Kimberly. That's a really good observation. And I think, in the context of that more fluid networking style, it's about creating these really strong psychological contracts on a one-to-one basis. And that's a dynamic contract. I mean, it's not something you do as a once-off, but it's really about forming these really trust-based alliances and having the confidence and courage and flexibility to be able to meet people where they are and invite them with you into this third space. Being in Dubai, it's the most diverse city in the world, so difference is everywhere. And this idea that we need to find that tiny little piece of overlap between us before we can be in an alliance, I think is a little bit naive, because you work very hard to find that tiny bit of overlap, and then at the end of the day you find it's actually quite a superficial overlap. I think that's not where the solution is. Inclusive leadership is not trying to minimize the difference. Inclusive leadership is about acknowledging the difference, respecting the difference, and having the belief and the confidence to create that third space of working together that allows the difference to be there, but allows you to progress beyond difference into a viable working alliance.
And I know we're going to come on later and just look at a model, in terms of some key, I suppose, areas that you consider around inclusive leadership. But I suppose just a bit more, just in terms of any benefits that you see in terms of perhaps when, leaders are embracing this philosophy, actually.
Yeah. Well, at a very basic level, the immediate benefit of inclusive leadership is that your diversity starts to work for you. Because diversity in itself, by itself, is just fraught with challenges, roadblocks, difficulties. Diversity is not, to be diverse today is not a badge of honor, it's not even an achievement, it's just a fact. But to leave it there is actually to leave yourself in crisis. So the immediate benefit of inclusion, of inclusive leadership philosophy and approach, is that you start to be able to harness your diversity for positive effect. It starts to become your competitive advantage. Now, there are organizations that do this well internally and do it poorly externally. There are organizations that do it well externally and do it poorly internally. I've yet to meet the organization that does it well both internally and externally. Again, because I think there's this fear generally amongst leaders and within organizations and followers as well of taking a radical relationship approach to leadership. But in the world, as it evolves into this more digitized kind of, where these digitized interfaces with each other, this relational glue is becoming more important, not less important.
Thank you. So let's just think about it even more in terms of, obviously you're speaking about an ecosystem. We're sort of touching into the complexities that leaders are facing, and also as coaches that we're working with them. So in terms of some of the more systemic impact, I just wonder if there's anything else you wanted to say around that.
I think with inclusive leadership, you create a culture, as I said, of a thriving culture and a culture that sustains itself. So the impact of having an inclusive leadership culture is that there's far less remedial intervention needed. The system becomes self-regulating. So you have those lovely counter forces of instead of having to address bias in a procedural way, you have people showing up in authentic relationship that can, in a trusting and belief-filled way, challenge each other's biases. So you start to get that kind of self-calibrating impact within organizations, and it feels healthy. And it's something that can sustain the level of dynamic shift that is required in the world of work today. So when you take a relational lens to leadership, it's dynamic and it's agile. And the moment somebody new comes into the system, it shifts again. And it accommodates that newness. So, on so many levels, if we look at the level of conflict in the workplace, the level of burnout, the level of stress, the low level of performance, the attrition, I could go on and on. Inclusive leadership is kind of the antidote to many of the things that we're actually throwing a lot of energy at right now, simply because our leadership model really isn't working. And I know I'm oversimplifying, but it's a major factor.
And I suppose just from my perspective, because I obviously see a lot of synergies with mindful leadership in terms of actually another place that we often work in. So if I can just ask that, because as you talk there, I make connections. So
absolutely.
How does this relate to mindful leadership?
Yeah, so in an attempt to try and help clients to get their head around what is inclusive leadership, because I'm talking really philosophically now, and we have to make it tangible. These things that you're mentioning around conscious leadership, mindful leadership, these are skills and attitudes that inclusive leaders need in order to be able to find this third space and sustain their leadership from this third space. So one of the factors, for instance, we look at is awareness. And of course, that awareness is a very 360 awareness. It's awareness of who is it that I'm trying to include in the first place. Yeah. What are the trends in the workplace? Where is my leadership being invited to flex, change, adapt? Who is it I'm trying to lead? What is it like to lead baby boomers versus Gen Ys? You know, what is it like to lead people from different functional areas or different geographies? And so the awareness is out there, and then the awareness is in here as well. You know, how am I showing up? Who am I being right now? You know, we've been working with TA and ego states. What is it that's happening for me right now in the context of this leadership moment? How am I showing up? So awareness is a very basic skill, quality, attitude that mindful leaders, inclusive leaders need. And of course, mindfulness is a very powerful strategy to create that awareness.
And built on some shared values in terms of the collective.
Absolutely, discovering them.
Yeah.
You know, discovering those values. That's the exciting journey of inclusive leadership.
I see a question that's just come from Nazir around, have you got an example of one case how the diversity worked better with more inclusive leadership?
Yeah, so if you look at, just the research around innovation, for instance, how diversity breeds innovation and how innovation supports organizational sustainability. One of the trends that I notice in organizations, even those that have got a quite well-articulated D&I agenda, is we hire diversity, but then when people come inside the organization, we drive conformity, right? So that's not how we do things around here. Oh, you'll never get away with that. Best don't raise that. And so we silence the voices. So I recently was working with a client, which is a very prestigious academic organization, and only hire from Ivy League, and only hire people with really, really well-established academic credentials. And their tension is they want to become more diverse, they want to become more inclusive, and yet they're hiring after the pattern of the old. And a courageous head of faculty decided to break that mold, and it was the media faculty. And instead of hiring somebody with strong academic qualifications, who was the usual sort of male Ivy League kind of candidate, they hired a woman from a third world country who is a filmmaker and brought her in as a resource into the department to really give students a sense of what's it like when you go out into the real world and you apply the skill that you've learned. What's the real world of filmmaking about? And I interviewed this candidate, and she was absolutely blown away in the first place that she was considered for the role. She seriously considered not taking it in case it was a bit of a sort of cruel trick or joke, because she wasn't sure what she would encounter. But she did take the position. She came into a highly inclusive environment. She's absolutely thriving. Her students are thriving, and the university is benefiting incredibly from her commercial and practical experience. So there's a really good example of an intelligent decision around diversity and inclusion that is actually producing tremendous value for the organization and is becoming a differentiator for this university in the region.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's just talk a bit more, because we've sort of touched on some points. I mean, we take just what you were talking about in terms of self-awareness. So maybe it's time now for you to just share a bit more around your model around inclusive leadership. Yeah.
So what we've come up with is this, and this is a simplistic model, but it's a starting point for organizations to begin to think about, okay, philosophically we're aligned with this idea, but how do we actually build the skills and attitudes to sustain this? And of course, we've touched on awareness, but an awareness there is basically, I need to be aware of what's happening in my workforce. I need to be aware of what's happening in the market. I need to understand who it is I'm trying to include as a basic. Okay? Because if I'm trying to be inclusive in a way that is thoughtless, tendency is I'm going to have an affinity bias, and I'm going to try and include people that are just like me, and then we're going to just reproduce after our own kind, and we're going to screen out diversity instead of screening them. So number one. Number two is belief, and belief is really about consciousness. It's really about understanding what are the beliefs and biases that drive my behavior. What are the beliefs and the biases, the often implicit, unspoken assumptions, beliefs that are sitting inside of the system that are driving decisions towards exclusion. Yeah, we make assumptions, and I work with organizations where I unearth these assumptions all the time. You know, working with a big logistics company, and there's an assumption that only men can fulfill this kind of role. And then you move into a different region of the same company, and you find that only women in that particular region are fulfilling the role. And you know, those beliefs, there is opportunity to then challenge those beliefs in the system. So I think it's important, you know, to check what are the assumptions that the current system is running on that really need to be challenged. So inclusive leaders know how to do that. They're focusing on that. The third thing is cultural capability. And of course, this is not just knowing about cultural groups. And when I use the word culture here, I don't mean ethnicity. I mean all the different cultural groupings we might come across: gender, age, ethnicity, functional area, educational background, etc. It's the ability to understand what some of the cultural dynamics are that are happening within the people that you lead. It's also noticing your own motivation to want to deal with things and what you feel attracted to and curious about and what you feel triggered by. And then also having some strategies to approach those situations. It's not a one-size-fits-all, it's a one-size-fits-one. So how do I plan for this interaction with this particular group? And then how do I show up? What's the action that I need to demonstrate in this particular scenario, verbal and non-verbal, in order to have the impact that I want to have? So there's a lot of thinking there around cultural capability and being able to flex your behavior and your approach when the context shifts. Drive is the next one. So drive is really about courage. It's about having a belief in organizational improvement and a belief in your ability to find that third space with people and to have the courage to explore it, and have this continuous learning mindset, improvement mindset. So, you know, inclusive leaders are driven, they're self-motivated to improve. It's never done. It's only as done as your next encounter with the next person. You know, so there's that. And then empowerment is something you would expect to see around a model of inclusive leadership, because that's really about psychological safety and empowering others to create this adult-to-adult contract that is going to help you explore this third space and to you know, develop capability in this third space. So very much around giving people a voice, allowing people to bring their difference into the conversation, deep listening, respect, psychological safety, etc. And then the last piece is a kind of practical piece. So that's really about flexibility in how you actually structure working alliances with people. So we've done a lot of work around, a lot of research around flexible work and what are the key enablers for different groups in the workforce. And what we found is inclusive leaders understand that not everybody wants to approach work in the same way, and that it's not optimal for everyone to approach work in the same way. So there is something about creating those one-size-fits-one alliances across the employee life cycle. So somebody might join and 5 days a week, 8 hours a day works for them, and then something changes in their life situation and actually that doesn't work for them anymore, but they're still a good employee and they're still somebody you want in your system. So how do you flex around that? So we find that in principle people are attracted by the idea, but sometimes challenged in terms of how to implement that. So those are the 6 sort of factors that we use in our 360 to help evaluate the current level of inclusive leadership, but also focus on in developing inclusive leadership capability. They're not exhaustive. They're kind of baskets where a lot of other things sit in, but it's a starting point for organizations to begin to develop that capability within their leadership.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy. So, you know, I suppose as someone that is very passionate about coaching, and I obviously see the synergies in terms of the work that we do as coaches, but, you know, thinking about the modern workplace and where I suppose the trajectory of leadership and what's required, what's important, you know, for us as coaches to consider around this in our work, really?
And I think you'll probably verify this in terms of your experience. My experience as a coach is, you know, people are promoted based on their technical capability and they sort of move up the leadership ladder, but very often they get to a place where their people skills are far more important and completely underdeveloped because they've never paid attention. So I think as coaches, we are in a unique position to support leaders to develop some of these people skills and to also connect with their own leadership philosophy and their own desired leadership impact. And from there, it's actually really powerful and almost natural to have a conversation around, well, you know, how do you want to show up as a leader? What is the impact you want to have? And what are the skills that you think you need in order to be able to demonstrate the kind of, or create the kind of impact that you're looking for? Where do you want your people to be in 5 years' time? You know, what is the natural impact of your leadership that you're wanting to create? What's the imprint you want to leave? And in coaching, it's a unique opportunity to have that conversation. And my experience is people really care about that. They really care about it. For the vast majority of people, once they come out of that scarcity thinking of I either have to, I have to achieve these objectives, and then the only way I'm going to do that is by squeezing this person harder. Once they come out of that scarcity mindset and realize that it could be an and, not an or. You could get someone to perform well and thrive and grow and have a positive impact. That's a conversation that leaders do want to have.
Thank you. Thank you. So again, I'm just going to pause and just see if there are any other sort of questions that people would value hearing Tracy speak to. I can see a recommendation there from Richard, but yeah, any other questions coming through at the moment? And I suppose as we're just pausing for a moment, Tracy, just anything else that I suppose we haven't touched on at the moment that just from your experience is important around this topic?
I think the word sustainability just keeps coming up for me. So I do think we need to start thinking about sustainability in leaders, sustainability in organizations, and how we need to shift our leadership towards that. So I think there are a lot of good and related leadership models emerging now around regenerative leadership, mindful leadership, conscious leadership, and I think they're all touching the same points. That maybe the common denominator here is sustainable human relationships in the workplace and how we become catalysts for that. That's what fascinates me about inclusive leadership. I think the how of it will continue to evolve, and it should, but the why of it is something we need to connect to.
Yeah, and I suppose, under everything that we do as coaches, our ability to create that human-to-human relationship is the vital thing. And I suppose there's a piece for me around my belief around how we can role model the inclusivity in terms of the way that we work with people.
Absolutely.
Because I suppose I'm just reflecting on how often people ask me, can a coach anybody? Are there people that I shouldn't coach? And it's just this whole sense of, well, what's that question that's starting to touch into, actually.
It's lovely. Yeah. So I think when you're asking yourself that question, is because you've come to that place of self-awareness, of understanding that the way I show up is not the same for everybody, actually. And is this an opportunity for me to grow? Is this an opportunity for me to deepen my leadership impact and to really become conscious and to really plan how to be inclusive and to create this alliance in this situation, because it doesn't flow naturally to me because I'm seeing some differences. And I think that's a great nugget of revelation right there for a leader to think about. Something also that, in coaching you can explore and enable.
Thank you. And I can just see a couple of reflections there about Kimberly, just making a connection with obviously the ecology and the climate crisis at the moment. Yeah. Mike just saying about, do leaders need to experience a failure in their scarcity style before recognizing the need to search for an alternative? And then from Matthew, are you seeing any impact on organizations of the current approaches of divisiveness in the US and the UK? So I suppose, think about Trump and Boris. And
absolutely. So I think when we're in a transition point, the extreme manifestation of what isn't working, you start to see that as well. And yes, it does. The current leadership model does need to fail, and in fact, I believe it is failing. The realization that it's failing is going to come in stages. But yeah, I mean that's how we learn, right? The breaking down of the old to make room for the new.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you. So as always, when we bring these sessions to a close, I'm just going to invite you to reflect on any insights you're personally taking away, and what you'll put into action. But just as you're starting to think about it, I'm just going to see if Tracy does have any resources that you would point people to, or just if there's anything that comes to mind that would be useful for people to connect to after this, if this is a topic they're interested in.
I think one of the things that I found useful, which is not inclusive leadership per se, but is the work that's been done around regenerative leadership. So I think reading about regenerative leadership, it's a lovely model that kind of helps you locate where your current leadership is and invites you into this regenerative space, which for me is exploring that third space. So that's very useful. And I think the work that's been done around conscious leadership also feeds into this very nicely. So I think there are places to explore there. And I think, just looking at the whole area around thriving and well-being in organizations, the work that Arianna Huffington is doing. And for me, that it's a place of real interest because it is highlighting the crisis, and it's inviting us into a more ecological sustainability focus within organizations, which I think creates a platform for inclusive leadership to really shine and sort of manifest its true benefits.
Thank you, Tracy. So just before we end, I'm just going to point to the next session. So we'd love to see you again on the next webinar, which will be a session that my colleague Liz Palmer will be speaking to me in terms of our experiences of three-way contracting. So again, a really important piece, and how do we do this more systemically? So that will be on the 14th of February at 1 o'clock. So all that's left really, Tracy, is to say thank you so much for your time today. Really, really fascinating subject. And I mean, I'm sure that we'll be talking again later in the year about this. But thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So just remind everybody that the recording will be available on the website, on YouTube, Catalyst Wonfor channel next week. So go well, and look forward to speaking with you again.